some police departments that would not let, back at that time it was INS, know when they had encountered or arrested somebody who was in the country illegally. And some places, and there were also, it was mostly big cities at that time. And the federal government wanted to say, look, you can't tell police officers on your force that they're not allowed to get in touch with us. That Congress wanted to make that illegal, and so that's the law that passed. Today, the sanctuary policies basically take three forms. The first is that they prohibit communication between local officers and ICE, or if you're in the vicinity of the border, it would be the Border Patrol. Now, they have policies that say things like, you cannot make inquiries about someone's immigration status, or you can't tell ICE if someone that you've arrested admits to being in the country illegally. And I actually have Philadelphia as one of the most notorious sanctuary jurisdictions. Let's see if I can find there. Yeah, police officers shall not inquire about a person's immigration status, except in certain specific instances, most notably a violent felon, in the case of a violent felon, and that they shall not disclose information relating to an individual's immigration status, and that they shall not transmit information relating to an immigrant to federal authorities. So these are policies that are clearly inconsistent with federal law. The other form that sanctuary policies take is that some jurisdictions do not allow ICE officers to come into jails to interview people who are in custody in a jail. And the third form that sanctuary policies can take is that some jurisdictions have put restrictions on local police and sheriff and said that you are not ever to comply or honor an ICE arrest warrant or a request to hold someone for ICE. And I should probably back up a little bit. It's important when talking about sanctuary policies to understand how ICE operates. ICE, the federal agency that enforces immigration laws, has as its highest priority arresting people who are that small fraction of people in the community of in the population of illegal immigrants who are causing problems in the community, mainly by getting arrested committing crimes. It's a small fraction of the population. But that's a priority because if people are here illegally and also doing bad things in the community, they should be the top priority. But ICE does not patrol the streets of the American community going around looking for illegal immigrants. They depend on local law enforcement agencies to let them know when someone has been arrested who is also probably in the country illegally. There are also people who are here legally who commit crimes as well. And when they do, that often means that they lose their status as either a legal immigrant or, say, someone here on a student visa or as a guest worker or something like that. So it's not just people in the country illegally. The main way they get this information now is that most people who are arrested are fingerprinted. Those fingerprints go to the FBI for a check so that local officers can know who they're dealing with. If that person has been arrested somewhere else, maybe has a warrant out for them in another part of the country, internationally, something like that. Those fingerprints now also go to the Department of Homeland Security and to ICE so that they can be compared with their huge repository of fingerprints of every non-citizen that they know about who is in the country. Either legal people who have entered on visas, people who have green cards, people who have become naturalized citizens, and people that the Border Patrol has caught and deported before. They keep those fingerprints. And so if someone is arrested for robbing a bank in Millersville, those fingerprints, and let's say they were deported 5 years ago, they were in the country legally deported, ICE would get a hit on that person and would send a request to the police department locally and asking them to hold on to that person because they want to put them into deportation proceedings after their local criminal charges are disposed of. So that's how ICE finds out about it. They don't go around looking for people. All they want is cooperation from local law enforcement agencies, just they would any other law enforcement agency, say, yeah, okay, we'll hold on to it. We didn't know that this was a person wanted for murder in El Salvador. Or, we didn't know that this was a drug trafficker from China, whatever the case may be. And so ICE asks, and usually local agencies comply with their request. I've counted, I try to keep track of all the sanctuary policies in the country, and there are now about 300 across the country, mostly in the big cities, but there are 17 in Pennsylvania that in some way do not fully cooperate with ICE, and with the largest being Philadelphia. There are 3,000 county sheriffs in the country and thousands of police departments as well. About 90% of the local law enforcement agencies do and want to cooperate with ICE. And the reason's obvious, because if they release, if they don't hold on, if they ignore the notice that ICE has sent to them, that person is going to be released back into the country or into the community, and may or may not show up for their local criminal proceedings, but often is going to avoid deportation and be in the community and potentially going to commit another crime. The most famous case that people know about is the case of a woman by the name of Kate Steinle in San Francisco, who in 2015 was out walking with her father on a pier in San Francisco, and a man who had been, let's see if I can get this right, I think he was deported 4 or 5 times before, had a series of relatively petty offenses on his record, shot and killed this woman, Kate Steinle, in front of her father. And he was at large because he had been released by the San Francisco sheriff, despite the fact that ICE got had him in custody. San Francisco said they wanted to prosecute him for a local offense. ICE turned him back over to San Francisco. Then they changed their mind and decided not to prosecute him, and rather than give him back to ICE for deportation for the 6th time or whatever, they just released him to the streets and never to be seen again until he was arrested for this murder. Well, he's accused of murder. He has not been convicted of it yet. These cases happen all over the country, numerous cases. In Philadelphia, there was somebody released under the sanctuary policy, and then a few weeks later when he was arrested for raping a woman. So that's the reason why most law enforcement agencies want to cooperate with ICE. The reason some of these places have sanctuary policies is because local political leaders adopt them for a variety of reasons. The main justification that they give for sanctuary policies is that they maintain that in order to have trust between immigrants in the community and local authorities, they believe that there should be kind of a firewall between local police and federal immigration authorities. And they maintain that immigrants will be too afraid to come forward and report crimes, or too afraid to approach authorities for things that they need if they are afraid of being turned over to ICE. Now, I think this is something that authorities should be concerned about, most definitely. We want everyone in the community to feel comfortable coming forward to report a crime if they are a victim or if they know something about a crime that has taken place. So I think that's a legitimate concern if it were true that immigrants are refraining from or too afraid to report crimes, but it turns out actually that it's not. I can't find a shred of evidence that this is actually true on any significant scale, and I can go into this in a little more detail. But I have found some good evidence that actually refutes that claim that having a sanctuary policy has a positive effect on crime reporting and on trust. The other main reason that sanctuary policies have been adopted is that, and I think this is the real reason that most of them are adopted, is that the local political leaders simply disagree with immigration policy and disagree that immigration laws should be enforced in the way that they are enforced. And so they've adopted basically a "you can't make me" attitude toward immigration enforcement. They tell the federal government basically, you know, you can make all the requests and all the notifications you want, but you can't make me help you enforce immigration law. That's true. The federal government cannot make them, but the reality is that the federal government is not asking them to help enforce they're not asking them to enforce immigration laws. They're asking them to give the same level of cooperation as would be extended to any other law enforcement agency. And indeed, as I mentioned, there is a federal law that says you can't have a law that prohibits your individual officers from giving us information or asking us for information, which is something, again, that a lot of officers want to do. If you have someone in custody who has no identification, and often will admit that they're in the country illegally, it's good policing practice to try to identify who that person is. You want to know who you're dealing with. Is this just some petty thug or, you know, punk from the neighborhood, or is this somebody who actually is more of a public safety threat? And so for the same reason that they fingerprint people and run them through the FBI database, they might want to check in with ICE to make sure that this is not someone who is wanted in another country, who is, you know, some other threat that they're not aware of, maybe even a national security threat, which is, you know, a little less likely to be the case, but still, you always want to know who you're dealing with. So that, you know, that's really what ICE is asking for, is a basic information sharing to take place. And when you consider that 90% of ICE's caseload is people who are deportable from the country and have been convicted of another crime, then you start to understand that really the people who are protected by sanctuary policies are the criminals, because they are able to avoid deportation when the local authorities release them rather than turn them over to ICE. And it's important to remember too, I mean, immigration law is not some obsolete law on the books that doesn't deserve to be enforced. It protects job opportunities for Americans and for legal immigrants. It protects public resources for education and health and welfare that should be reserved for citizens or people who are here legally. And it protects the safety and security of our communities. And again, that's because the main target for deportation is that small fraction of the population that's here illegally and committing crimes. So ICE, starting in about 2014, started keeping track of the individuals who were released by sanctuary jurisdictions rather than turned over to ICE. And what they found out was that just over 60% of the illegal aliens that ICE was trying to seek custody of, who were released by sanctuary policies, already had a serious criminal record before the instant arrest that led ICE to discover them in the community, either a felony or a violent misdemeanor. Within 8 months of the time period that they studied, they found that 23% of the people who were released by sanctuary policies were again arrested for another crime after their release. And ICE was only able to go out and rearrest about 40% of those. The rest remained at large. ICE recently reported that since 2014, there have been 10,000 criminal aliens released by sanctuary policies who have gone on to commit another crime. So that's basically, in the last almost 4 years, 10,000 crimes that have been committed and new individuals victimized as a result of sanctuary policies. The most recent big case is one out in Sonoma County, where a guy with kind of, again, a series of string of kind of petty offenses like assault and domestic violence, was arrested, released by the Sonoma County Sheriff. Sonoma County has a pretty egregious sanctuary policy. 2 weeks later, killed his ex-wife. And California has passed the strictest state sanctuary law. It hasn't gone into effect yet, but it will in January, basically saying that no law enforcement officer in the entire state is allowed to communicate with ICE or cooperate with ICE, except for a few of the most egregious types of felonies. So the sanctuary supporters say that they have no responsibility for the problems created by these releases, that people commit crimes, and that ICE should just go arrest them. But that's easier said than done. And this is kind of the irony about sanctuary policies, is that they say that localities that believe in them say that they adopt them because they don't want to intimidate immigrants in the community by the kind of street-level enforcement of immigration laws. But what happens is when local authorities release deportable criminals back to the streets, ICE still has the responsibility to find and deport them. So ICE has to take to the streets and has to arrest these people in their homes, in their workplaces, on the street, and that actually creates the exact kind of immigration enforcement that the pro-sanctuary people say that they don't like. And think about it, if you're an ICE officer and there was a gang member released by sanctuary policy that you want to go remove, where would you rather arrest that individual? In the jail where he was held after being pulled over for DUI or vandalism or something? Or would you rather go to his dwelling where you don't know who else is going to be there, you don't know if he might be armed? It's much more dangerous for ICE officers, for the public, for family members, for everyone, if ICE has to make these arrests on the street rather than in the jails, which is a controlled environment. And it's also more expensive for that kind of enforcement to take place. And it's disruptive. Others say that they understand and deplore the public safety consequences of sanctuary problems, but they believe that the sheriffs have no choice to ignore ICE's requests for holds because of some court cases, including one in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, that's rather groundbreaking. But what those court cases have said is that it is not mandatory for local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with ICE. But that's not the same as saying it's illegal. So it is possible legally and constitutionally. There are a number of state courts that have found that there are no violations of anyone's civil rights when local law enforcement agencies cooperate with ICE. But on the other hand, the federal government, because of the 10th Amendment, cannot force state and local jurisdictions to expend resources on assisting with federal immigration enforcement. So there's this kind of debate now taking place. It's the federal government can't mandate this, but what the Trump administration has decided to do is to incentivize cooperation and penalize non-cooperation. They recognize that they can't force anything, but they want to get local jurisdictions to try to change their mind, and they have support from Congress as well. And the main leverage that the federal government has, especially over law enforcement agencies, is money. And so starting in 2015, the chair, his name is Representative John Culberson from Texas, became very upset by the increasing number of repeat offenders who had been illegal aliens that ICE was trying to deport that sanctuary policies released. And he's the member of Congress that controls the budget of the Department of Justice. And so he wanted to start imposing he wanted actually the Department of Justice to start withholding law enforcement grants to places that were stiff-arming ICE. And so he did some research and found that And the federal government gives out millions of dollars in grants every year to local, state and local law enforcement agencies. He found that there was already a requirement on the books that said every jurisdiction that receives DOJ funding has to be in compliance with all federal laws. And so he said, well, what about 1373? That's a federal law. It says that sanctuary policies are illegal. And he went to former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and said, I want you to start enforcing this on grantees. And she pretty much had to agree. And so in the spring of 2016, the Department of Justice, they actually used a list that I created of monitoring about 300 sanctuary jurisdictions, and they picked the top 10 in the country that had the worst, most egregious policies and were getting the most in Department of Justice funding. And it was, Philadelphia was one of them. And they sent them letters saying, you know, you're getting all this money from us every year. You're going to have to certify that you're in compliance with all federal laws, especially this one on sanctuary policies. And they all had to sign it to say, yes, we are. So that was in the spring of 2016. By the spring of 2017, I'm sure most of them thought, Hillary Clinton is going to be our next president. She's really not going to want to crack down on sanctuaries. And whoever her attorney general would be is not going to really enforce this strictly. Well, we all know what happened. The Trump administration takes office. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has a very different view of sanctuary policies and wants to crack down on them. He sends out a letter last spring to all of these 10 sanctuary jurisdictions saying, I need, you got this money, you signed this paper, I want you to show me how you are actually in compliance because I think you're a sanctuary. They had, and asked them to submit some documentation. Just last week, the Department of Justice announced that 5 of the 10 jurisdictions, 4 of the 10 jurisdictions were in the clear. Miami-Dade County in Florida changed on its own. They just decided they didn't want to be a sanctuary anymore and lose the money. Milwaukee, Las Vegas, and one other, Connecticut, were found to be complying with federal law just last week. A letter was issued to Philadelphia, New York City, Chicago, New Orleans, and Cook County, which surrounds Chicago, that they are going to have to pay back the millions of dollars in certain Department of Justice grants that they received unless they come into compliance by a week from tomorrow, October 27th. So we're going to find out if this is really going to happen. I believe that they're going to follow through on it. The Department of Justice, and I can talk more about what they were asked to do, told them how they could come into compliance. It needs to be seen whether or not they actually will. And so what we have now is a big game of chicken that's about to kind of, climax in about a week. Some of the sanctuary jurisdictions, like the mayor of New York City, the mayor of Chicago, and the mayor of Philadelphia are all saying, you can't take our money away. There's a lawsuit that was started in California where the judge out there told the Department of Justice that they could not bar sanctuaries from getting all federal funding, but there was a little paragraph in that court ruling that a lot of people didn't read that said, but you can block their DOJ grant funding because it's already a rule that you have to be in compliance with federal law. So Mayor de Blasio and Mayor Emanuel are all saying, well, there's this lawsuit, we're going to be stopped from blocking our money. We're going to find out, I guess, in about a week if they really, if Philadelphia could potentially have to pay back $1.7 million from 2016 and potentially going back all the way to 2012, which is how many years they've been sanctuarying in these grants. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens. There's also legislation pending before Congress. The House of Representatives has passed a bill that would further clarify that sanctuary policies are illegal and what the government can do about it. There's talk of including that in a package of reforms because we have this other issue out there that's a hot one right now, which is the issue of deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is the President Obama gave a temporary legal status to people who arrived illegally as kids. Their status is expiring in March unless Congress passes something to deal with that, probably an amnesty. But it's believed that the Trump administration and that most House Republicans and Senate Republicans will not agree to that unless there are some other provisions along with that. And it's expected that something on sanctuary policies could be part of that. So it remains to be seen. But it's going to get very interesting. And I think it's really a larger constitutional issue at hand here is what really can the federal government do if state and local governments are getting in their way? Does federal law really trump local law? And even if it doesn't, is it really a good idea to have a policy that obstructs federal law, even if you have some humane and warm-hearted feelings for doing it because you think immigration laws are too harsh? But then what about the impact of not enforcing immigration laws on our legal immigration system and on those Americans who are affected by not enforcing immigration laws, whether it's because they lose job opportunities or because they're harmed by someone who was released? It's a whole set of issues that I think are gradually going to be sorted out, but it's become very interesting. So I'll stop there. I've talked long enough, but I'd love to hear what questions you have or things that you would like to raise or anything at all. Can I call on people? Or, okay. Sir.
I got a lot of questions. First question.
Okay.
I always do.
Well, we have a lot of time problems.
Yesterday we talked about vetting, and they're talking about vetting refugees from here to America or France or wherever they are going. Now my question, they were vetted very 7 years, we heard stories about 10 years, people vetting. My question is, they have sanctuary cities, and is there a difference between the crime of those people that were vetted for sanctuary cities or vetted to come here, and the difference between illegal immigration? Who's committing the crimes? Is it the people from Somalia and Maine that live in that city up there? I can't remember the name of it. Or is it just random people that are just not documented?
That's a good question. And the short answer is nobody really knows. And I and a colleague have done years of research on this, and I've studied, I think I've probably read every academic paper ever written on the subject of immigration and crime. And the problem is that no law enforcement agencies keep track, or I should say very few law enforcement agencies in the country even keep track of the immigration status of people who are committing crimes. Texas Texas keeps track of who's charged with crimes, but that's a different thing. No one really knows. We know the status of most of the people in the federal prison system, and about 23% of the inmates in the federal prison system are non-citizens. But the federal prison system is not exactly like, it's only a small share of the overall correction system in the country, and it's different kinds of crimes. A lot of those are drug smuggling and people busted at the border. So I think that kind of inflates the number of non-citizens. We don't really know. There have been some scholars who have tried to use Census Bureau data to figure this out. The Census Bureau says don't do that because we're not really counting people. It counts institutionalized people, which includes people in nursing homes and assisted, all kinds of scenarios that are not corrections. From the best I can tell from reviewing a lot of data that I obtained from ICE through FOIA and a lot of the big law enforcement agencies like LA County and places that have more illegal occupants and really track it, I don't see any difference in the rates of offending between citizens and non-citizens. As far as my belief is that immigrants are no more or less likely to commit crimes than anybody else. And if there may be a slightly higher rate of offending among illegal immigrants, but I believe that is because they tend to be younger and more male, slightly than the population at large, and that's, I mean, true of that particular demographic commits more crimes, whether, you know, no matter what, whether you're immigrant or not. So I think immigrants are people, illegal immigrants are people, some of them commit crimes, and it's about the same rate. But to me, that's not really relevant to the issue of sanctuaries, because the point is, if even one person who's here in the country illegally and commits a crime, we need to have a system to remove that person and all of those people. And so it's more like, how can we build that system that enables the government to remove those people who are causing problems with, you know, and allows ICE to prioritize on those. It doesn't force them into the type of enforcement that I discussed. But to me, that's the issue that's important to think of. Did that answer your question?
Somewhat.
Yeah,
It's tough, but you didn't have the stats.
Oh, and on the refugee vetting, this is a different topic, but just to be clear, the vetting doesn't take 10 years. It may take a couple weeks. But the agencies that do it are so backlogged that people may be in limbo and waiting to be vetted for those years. I mean, we've heard a lot of the refugee discussion, oh, these people are vetted for 2 years. That's not really the case.
Well, yesterday we had two Somali refugees and an officer from the, I can't remember the name of the agency.
USCIS?
She was here describing the whole thing. She had a disclaimer and all that, so it seemed pretty official. These two gentlemen said they were in the camp for so long that it was like 6 months, every 6 months they had to redo their physical. They were there and they had no reason to, so.
Yeah, that's just because their files have been
stories.
sitting there for so long, which is a problem. Yes?
Did you say there's a law or an article that compels law enforcement to cooperate with ICE?
The law is 8 U.S. Code 1373. And it says that no state or local government can have a policy that prohibits officers from communicating with federal immigration authorities. So you can't have a policy that says never call ICE, you're not allowed to contact. That's the way it reads. I know it's like a net somehow. How would that be grammatically double? I don't know. There are some states that have laws, like Arizona says you must contact ICE if you have reason to believe that the person that you encountered or arrested is in the country illegally.
Why isn't that federal law tested?
Well, I think it is being tested now, because the issue is that the federal government has no way to enforce that law other than now it's trying to withhold federal grants. It could also seek an injunction against the sanctuary policy. That has not been tested yet. That was threatened under the Obama administration when Cook County passed their sanctuary ordinance. And I think it may come to that the Attorney General has to go and say, you know, we're seeking an injunction against this policy because it's keeping us from doing our job and it violates 1373. I think that would be the next step after this funding issue plays out. Because I
first,
pardon?
I would have done that first.
A lot of people think that. But then you have to recognize too, how likely is it that a federal judge in some of these districts would agree with that. And it would have to, eventually it's going to make it to the Supreme Court. And I think they're kind of looking for the right way to make that happen. Yes?
You talked a little bit about the reason that local politicians, specifically and leaders, give for having these policies, the sanctuary city policies. And I think you correctly characterize why they say that, and then you make an argument for why this is not the case, why it actually makes perhaps immigrants, specifically illegal immigrants, less likely to trust local authorities, and just maybe authorities in general. But given that the argument is that they trust local authorities more, not federal authorities, isn't that still true? that they will trust local authorities more if they're not giving their information to ICE, to federal authorities. And given that, doesn't that process then of just, okay, we've got this person in custody, subvert the justice process? Because that person hasn't necessarily been proven to have committed a crime. They haven't gone through the system yet to say, you know what, we arrested this person, they did commit the crime, and so they should suffer some consequence for it on a local level, separate from the federal law.
That's a good question, both of them. Let me start with the second part of that, which is this issue of that they were just innocent until proven guilty, I guess is the way to put it, which is true. The thing is when ICE, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit of the operations of how ICE does its job, but I mentioned that the fingerprints are shared. This is how ICE finds out about an individual who's in local custody in one of two ways. Either they've received the fingerprints and matched them with prints in their system, which means that ICE issues a document to that local law enforcement agency that provides a statement of probable cause, which is actually greater than the legal threshold that ICE needs to make an arrest. They state that they have probable cause to believe that this person is a removable alien, and they will check off some reasons why. And they will also issue an arrest warrant, which is, again, standard law enforcement practice. So it's not that ICE is, there used to be cases in the past where ICE would just say, I don't find this person in our databases, they've admitted to not being a citizen of the United States, I want to take a look at them, I want you to hold them. That policy was dropped years ago, like in 2012. So that was, I think, a constitutional issue years ago, but is no longer the case. That's been reformed, which is a good thing. It's frustrating for ICE sometimes, but we have a constitution. They're establishing the proper legal threshold to keep someone in custody. The issue sometimes is, do state and local authorities, are they covered by the feds having met that threshold for enforcing federal law? And this is being hashed out in the courts, and I think that, there are different views on it. I think that clearly, state and local law enforcement agencies have an inherent authority to assist other law enforcement agencies under the principle of comity. Others, there are advocacy organizations that are arguing no. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts a couple months ago just said no. There's no state and local authority to hold someone on federal charges, especially because they're administrative charges, not criminal. Again, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. But the issue for the law enforcement agencies, am I going to get sued for holding someone for ICE? And so that's why now ICE is not asked, ICE will ask them to hold them, but if they won't hold them, they say, give us 48 hours notification before the person is released, so we can be there when they are released and take them into our custody. We'll make the arrest, not you. And still, the most egregious sanctuaries are saying, no, we're not even, there's like the Philadelphia policy that I read says that they're not even allowed to call ICE and say, this dude's getting out in 24 hours or 48 hours. That they're prohibited from doing that, and I believe that is against federal law. The 1373 clearly says you can't tell that jail officer that they're not allowed to call ICE to tell you when someone's going to be released. Now on the trust issue, I think that's a legitimate point. Access to protection is very important. It's something that all law enforcement agencies have to keep in mind. The problem is from what I've seen and observed and asked numerous law enforcement agencies and advocacy groups about is that, first of all, victims and witnesses are never targets for immigration enforcement. They simply are not, unless the victim or witness is also a wanted criminal or something like that. And that's the message that needs to be spread more widely to the immigrant community, that no matter what your status is here, if If you have been the victim of a crime or know something, you have nothing to fear in coming forward to local police and reporting that crime. And that police agency is not going to report you to ICE just because they happen to, you come forward. I don't think that we need to suspend the enforcement of immigration laws generally in cooperation with respect to criminals in order to convince people to come forward to report crimes. I don't think there's any conflict between community policing goals and cooperation with immigration enforcement. That most law enforcement agencies have adopted tools where people can report. They have anonymous tip lines. They have, I know in Chicago and some of the towns around it, they have non-uniform, non-badge personnel in substations taking crime reports so that people aren't intimidated. They speak the languages of the community. They engage with the community. All of those, to me, are very positive ways of helping people get over what may be a legitimate fear of authorities because in your home country the police were corrupt, or you didn't, the survey literature I've set of immigrants that ask them, were you a crime victim? And if they say yes, did you report it to the police? And they say no, they ask them why. It turns out that the number one reason people, if they don't report a crime, don't report it, is because of language barriers. So I think it's just much more important to focus on that access issue rather than stiff-arming the feds in trying to enforce immigration laws against criminals. But again, it has become a political issue. And I think too many local leaders feel that they have something to gain politically by denouncing and refusing to cooperate with immigration enforcement when there are other ways that they could accomplish those trust goals.
Can I ask a follow-up on that real quick? So you referred again, and I'm trying not to nitpick, but these people as criminals. But again, I think in the cases you're talking about, they haven't necessarily been proven to be criminals at a local level. At the federal level, perhaps, but as far as the local community is concerned, if they've been arrested for something, doesn't mean
True.
They have committed it, and that's the standard I'm speaking to, as far as the local interest of turning that person over to the federal authorities.
Well, this gets into another larger thing that's being debated, is that I think people are subject to immigration enforcement if they're in the country illegally, whether they're a criminal or not. It's that this is how the feds find out about them, is because of their encounter with the local officers. If a person is a priority for ICE doesn't care whether they get off on the most recent charge that they were booked for. That they may prove to be, and I'll give you a case in point, is this is a true case near where I live. A woman from Portugal in the country illegally was driving drunk, crashed into a car, then she ran a stop sign, crashed into a guy, killed him. She was arrested. ICE asked to take custody of her. She first pled guilty. And then she found out that she was actually going to do time for that crash because of her intoxication and reckless driving. She withdrew her guilty plea. And the local prosecutor and the victim and ICE worked out a deal and said, okay, we're not going to prosecute her, but she's agreeing to deportation in lieu of prosecution. She wasn't convicted. She's not a criminal. But she was still deportable, and she did something pretty horrific. And so ICE deported her. So, I mean, I would argue that that's legitimate for ICE to do that, even though she was not convicted. The problem comes if you have local law enforcement agencies who are suspected of maybe going out and targeting people for enforcement just because they think that we'll get them, they think they're here illegally and they want them to be deported. That is something that we need to guard against very strictly. I mean, There have been accusations that have been made, and I think this is a fine line. That's up to local law enforcement agencies to make sure it doesn't happen, that kind of profile. And I think most of them have systems to try to combat that. I won't say it never happens, but that has to be avoided. Yes?
So you mentioned earlier about how it's really not more so victims who get targeted by ICE. You said it's usually the criminals. Are there any actual protections or policies that do keep a victim safe? Like, let's say I'm an immigrant, I can, on the crime committed towards, or I witnessed something. Is there anything that actually keeps me from being deported when I was seeing something verifying? Is there actual policy, and not just, well, you're not a priority right now because you didn't commit the crimes? Is there actual policy that keeps, I guess, witnesses or victims safe when they are reporting?
Yes, there is not only a policy, but there is a visa. And there are several different kinds of relief, they call it, that can be offered to someone. And in some ways, it's an incentive. There's a couple of them. There's one called a U visa, which is specifically for crime victims who assist in the prosecution of the offender. And the other is called there's parole. People can be paroled. There's something called an S visa. They call it the snitch visa. They call it the informant visa. So this is another really good reason why local law enforcement agencies should be talking to people about their immigration status in case they do need those protections, which are incredibly valuable. For instance, in prosecuting domestic violence offenders and especially in gang cases. So that's a good point. I'm glad you raised that. Yes. Yes.
Is it fair to say that of those 300 sanctuary jurisdictions that are predominantly in democratic areas, and if that's true, are there any that are red? I mean, are any of those 300 jurisdictions predominantly Republican? I mean, could you speak to a sanctuary city that would be in a solidly red state that operates any differently in terms of the federal government?
They do tend to be mostly big cities, but you know, there are 17 that I found in Pennsylvania that have some form of sanctuary policy and non-cooperation. Only 3, though, I believe are at risk of losing federal funds because it's really like, I mean, there is a spectrum of them. Some will just not, they have different, they'll cooperate for certain types of offenders, but not others. The 3 they're Philadelphia, one is Butler County and one is Lycoming County. I don't know if those are red or blue or purple or what, but the one, I think, good example is Texas. Travis County, well actually it started with Dallas County, where the sheriff there said, I'm going to start not cooperating in every instance. And then Travis County, which includes Austin, Texas, which is a kind of a blue flower in the red state of Texas. They adopted a full-blown, in my view, egregious sanctuary policy. And in response, the governor of Texas said, okay, you're not getting any more state law enforcement money. And then the state legislature passed a law that said sanctuary policies are illegal and that any public official who implements or endorses, was the really controversial word that they used, the sanctuary policy may be prosecuted and lose their badge if they're law enforcement or their position in local government. So Travis County actually is still operating because there's a lawsuit against the state law, which has been temporarily enjoined. And again, everything is, lawfare is the way of the world, or the way of the country right now. So we'll find out what happens with that. North Carolina has passed a law barring sanctuary policies. Mississippi, somebody else, I can't think of it. I know there's another one out there, but yeah, they tend to be in the big cities. Some of the state, California has now the big state limits.
How would prosecuting immigration kind of cooperation be with cases of presumed human trafficking? So say there's an arrest by local law enforcement under the assumption that these people are victims of human trafficking. Then does ICE come in at that point when it goes to courts, or is there certain points where ICE can't interact?
No, they would, if a local, and this does happen a lot actually, a lot of the human trafficking cases that are discovered by local law enforcement officers. If they start with a domestic violence incident or, prostitution or something like that, and, hopefully the local law enforcement agency is well trained and can recognize signs of trafficking. They almost always will go immediately to ICE, because ICE has the institutional expertise to try to prosecute these as, a federal crime. And ICE works with certain service providers in their local areas to set up protections for the victims and get them set up, whether it's in a safe house or some situation where the victims can be safe. They will provide them with a temporary legal immigration status until there's another visa for trafficking victims called the T visa. It takes some time to process, so they give them a temporary legal status. They find family members if needed. They have kids that they need to also bring them into the protected situation, and then get them a T visa as quickly as possible. And usually the victims will end up staying in the United States permanently if they want to. So ICE is pretty proactive and that's why they've all been, they established these networks so that they can immediately respond with services and get busy on the investigation to prosecute.
So is that T visa openly disclosed to the people, or do they have to figure it out, or is it just? So, say it's like sex work. So you're convicted of a crime of sex work. We find out later that you're actually a victim of human trafficking. In that conviction of, prostitution or whatever, do they proceed with deportation, or is it like you can try to plead your case for a T visa and we'll see if you buy it, or like what is that in that instance?
I would say most people, immigrants or whatever, are not aware of the T visa, but all of the service providing agencies, like people who are the organizations that are the advocacy groups that are running safe houses and providing services to people who want to get out of the sex trade, they all know about the T visa, and ICE is in contact with them. ICE has designated agents and officers in the local field offices who that's what they do. It's trafficking cases. And so they all know about these protections, but the key is really for the local law enforcement agency or a local shelter or whatever to recognize the signs of trafficking, to bump it up to that level of services and investigation. If they're not making that connection, the victims may not receive this protection. So, it's important that people working on that kind of law enforcement understand, first of all, how to recognize trafficking, and then how to, what to do next and how to bring in the feds. Does that answer your question? But I don't think people are walking around going, wow, maybe I should get a TV. I mean, I don't think the general public really is aware of those kinds of things, unfortunately. A person who knows that he or she is a victim of trafficking is probably not going to know that that protection is available.
No, right, but once they're arrested by law enforcement and then they're charged with prostitution or whatever, if they don't, so you're saying if local law enforcement doesn't recognize that they were victims of human trafficking, then they just go to jail or get turned over to the ICE for
That can
deportation?
that can be the outcome if it's not properly handled. There's a need for outreach on the part of ICE and some of these, and there have been programs for this in the past. I don't know how robust they are right now. I think most, I mean, I do a lot of law enforcement training. I think most of them pretty much are aware, like the program that I teach in regularly, they have a day on trafficking, what to do about it. And, you know, like I teach for a day on general immigration stuff, and then somebody different spends the same amount of time on trafficking. So I think there is general awareness, I hope anyway. I'm sure, you know, there could be more training and outreach done.
One final sort of out question on this is, it seems to be more of a political issue in many respects than a policy issue. If you can separate those two, but I'll try for a moment. It seems that one of the pieces of our framework, the intergovernmental framework, is that there are those folks that are in favor of more states' rights and more local rights than others, and you know, obviously there's a political spectrum there. Some of the folks that are in favor of this particular version, though, of federal enforcement are also folks that politically would be more in favor of states' rights in other political areas.
That's a good story.
Right?
Yeah, I think so.
Could you just speak to the sort of the politics of this for a moment? Where do you see the politics of that going?
I think where a lot of this is hitting the road is this notion of can the federal government force state and local governments cooperate. And I think that under the Trump administration, they're coming down on the side of no. We can force. And I think Republicans in Congress have determined that too. They're like, we very much want there to be tough immigration enforcement, but they're recognizing that they cannot force the issue. And that's why they're turning to the funding as the leverage. And so, you know, I mean, some people refer to it, though, ironically, as like nullification. That sanctuary policies are basically trying to nullify federal law, which is, you know, a different context altogether. But
They carried a strict approach, you know, to federalism, basically.
right, and so what what's going to have to be tested is how much funding can the federal government withhold? What kind of funding? You know, because we went through this with the whole Obamacare Affordable Care Act, you know, and that's where a lot of the case law comes from that suggests that the feds cannot just pick any, you know, withhold all federal funding, or, you know, they can't go after community development block grants, which are big. They've got to keep it narrowly focused on law enforcement and homeland security grants that are germane to immigration enforcement and no more. So we'll see.
Any other questions? Any final questions? Hearing none, let's give a round of applause.